Mr. Generous, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm so grateful that we have here today the watchdog responsible for government contracting, and thank you for producing an excellent report on the ArriveCAN scandal. I'm a father of 5 children, and I've changed a lot of diapers over the years, and none of them stink as much as the contracting system that you're describing in this report. This really is some of the craziest stuff we've ever heard at this committee, and that's saying something, because we've heard some pretty wild things at this committee.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
I first want to point out that in your report you mentioned, and this is on page 18.61, you mentioned what I think is a very bizarre issue, and that is that there is no written record of GC Strategies being contacted to submit a bid for their initial ArriveCAN contract. I think you say in your report, and I quote, "The only record of communication between the Crown and the supplier prior to signing of the contract was an email from the supplier with quoted rates for various IT professional resource categories." And I guess what I'm wondering is if you could tell us, does this mean that GC Strategies was directly contacted in an unofficial manner to submit a bid for ArriveCAN?
So I'd be speculating if I wanted to answer your question directly. However, we did note that it was unusual that there was no correspondence on file. One of the things we've noted in this and many other practice reviews is the lack of documentation. Now, it sounds administrative in nature, but it is the bedrock of demonstrating many of the tenets of public procurement, right? How can you be fair, open, and transparent if you cannot demonstrate any of those aspects? So documentation, again, is something that you'll hear from me very many times this evening, but it's a legitimate concern, not only in ArriveCAN, but in public procurement in general.
Thank you very much. So at this point, you would say it's very irregular with the amount of non-documentation that there was on this file.
I'll also add one additional characteristic. So typically when contracts are directed, as the one that you're pointing out, there is, as we mentioned in the report, less transparency around the process due to the nature of the directed process. It is, however, highly unusual to receive a proposal without any request to receive one, unless it's an unsolicited proposal, which this didn't seem to be.
And I'll just add, so the contract you were referring to was actually the second of the 3 non-competitive contracts issued to GC Strategies. So they would have been in CBSA doing work under an existing contract, a separate contract, at which point there was some discussion that occurred between officials at CBSA and GC Strategies that wasn't reflected in the documentation in the file.
Who actually chose GC Strategies? We've, I think, been misled and perhaps even lied to when it comes to the individuals knowing who, in fact, chose GC Strategies. Were you ever given any indication by CBSA as to who made contact with GC Strategies and asked for them to submit a bid?
We have no additional information to what's been discussed at this committee previously on that issue. That's unfortunately why we had to disclose the information in the manner that we did in the report.
Did you find any record highlighting that Deloitte was not being considered or had been bumped or put on a timeout when looking for a company to undertake this work?
Deloitte really didn't show up in much of the documentation. In respect to the competitive contract that GC Strategies won as the only bidder, Deloitte had indicated they were going to be they were interested in bidding, but then chose not to submit the bid. And with respect to that solicitation, that's where we point to overly restrictive mandatory criteria. But there was no indication of Deloitte being like in the penalty box or anything like that, as we heard at the committee.
And with the very few seconds I have left, have you contemplated any of the bottler allegations as part of your findings here?
So, as with everyone, we were obviously an interested party watching all of the OGO committee hearings. We did listen, obviously, to the allegations being made, and obviously took it into account in the sense that we understood them. However, they weren't incorporated directly into the report, no.
And your findings point to concerns in regards to lapsing of the processes for handling IT services contracts. But there's no allegation, however, of corruption, as far as I can tell from what I've read, and there's certainly no suggestion that there was political interference. Some are working hard, I think, to misconstrue one of your findings, namely the 76% of the contracts examined, the resources, right, as part of the original bill, and then ultimately they used different suppliers or they were swaps, as you've cited in your opening statement. And some may try to say that that means people paid under those contracts didn't actually do the work. When in fact, I think that's false or categorically false, because only people who carried out the work were actually paid, right? So I just want to get clarity on this finding, where those resources of 76% of contracts were between the time of the contract award and then the task authorization, that lapse and that. So I got three questions in particular, hoping I have time. One, this is allowed, right, under the rules for certain cases. However, the issue you seem to have brought forward, obviously, is that it's maybe happening too frequently. Is that correct?
Yes, I would indicate that 76% is much, much too frequently.
And did you find any evidence that the resources or the subcontractors were paid for work that was never performed?
As we mentioned in our opening statement, this concept is called typically around procurement circles bait and switch. And it's a known occurrence. However, there is a significant problem with it. And that problem is as follows. When you're bidding, and here the selection methodology was 70-30, indicating that it was 70 technical and 30 price, meaning the technical component is incredibly important. And the technical component is built up predominantly by the resources. Right. So when they're bidding, they provide for resources that ultimately are going to receive the highest technical score possible. So they might be awarded a contract based on technical resources that never perform any work. And then, unfortunately, the way the process worked in these instances, the resources that were provided did not have to meet the same merit criteria that the original resources did.
I'm going to continue with this theme of bait and switch. And as you pointed out in your report, 76% of the contracts did no actual, 76% of the 76% of the contracts, the resources proposed to work on the contract did no actual work on the contract. Do you see this as a form of fraud on behalf of the vendor that submitted the proposal?
So because this is actually a contemplated occurrence, it's the frequency with which that makes it so concerning, right? So the replacement of individuals is something that likely is to happen. And as another committee member rightly pointed out, it was, or some of this was happening during the time of the pandemic. But that being said, the systematic nature and the frequency that this was occurring was much higher. So it's the systematic non-compliance that becomes troubling.
And do you believe, after seeing this occur in 76% of the contracts that were awarded, that there should be a system in place to immediately suspend contracting with the company? Because we did see with this government that they had indicated that they were suspending operations across the government with this vendor and then later seemed to withdraw that. What are your thoughts on that, please?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Again, my role is to make recommendations to the departments themselves. In terms of an outcome for a specific supplier, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment because, again, that wasn't the nature of this review.
But system-wide, having seen this in this specific case, would you make that recommendation?
I would not. I have not, so I can't say I would have.
Okay. Yeah. This was alluded to earlier. There is now evidence that the chief information officer at the time, Min Do-han, who has appeared before this committee and who we are attempting to get back, deleted emails in regards to the procurement of this app. And although the reasoning behind it is not clear, he tried to explain publicly to the press, or I should say the press garnered information that he attempted to explain that was in the transfer of files from his laptop to a new system. But do you think this deletion of information could have possibly led to the incomplete information record that we have at this time?
Can't speculate specifically on the issue that you presented, though I will say that it is highly problematic in terms of the void of documentation. Now, I wouldn't suggest that one individual deleted all of the records that we didn't receive. However, obviously, if there was a true deletion, the impact would be very significant.
Is there currently no system in place to ensure that all communications are automatically uploaded and saved? There's the saying, something on the internet never goes away, lives on forever. Is this not the same with the Government of Canada and our systems?
So you'll see in the report, we do note a good practice around communications where there is an electronic database, and there are other electronic databases referenced. However, this is a systemic issue. The one reason why you didn't see a document retention style recommendation coming from us out of this report is because we've actually done previous reviews of both of these departments and found documentation deficiencies, so we've made that recommendation already, albeit we now have to follow up with those departments to ensure that documentation practices have in fact improved.
Recommendation clearly that this government did not listen to and attempt to fix. My last question is, GC Strategies won a $25.3 million contract in May of 2022. Is it correct that GC Strategies was the only one who could win the contract because the mandatory criteria required the winning bidder to have worked on 3 contracts the CBSA had previously sole sourced to GC Strategies? And can this contract still be considered to be competitive when the criteria is so restrictive?
So as we noted in the report, absolutely, the criteria were identified to be very restrictive in nature, and as we mentioned in the report, it was highly unlikely that any other participant in the process could have been the successful bidder other than GC Strategies, because as we noted in the report, they heavily relied on the 3 sole source contracts that they had provided to CBSA as justification for complying with the mandatories. And when you look at the uniqueness of the mandatories, that's why we were able to say on its face that these mandatories were overly restrictive. In terms of your second question, could we say that this was still competed? It was competed. However, these mandatories made it very difficult for any other participant to participate in that process.
Thank you, Chair. I'm so grateful that we have here today the watchdog responsible for government contracting, and thank you for producing an excellent report on the ArriveCAN scandal. I'm a father of 5 children, and I've changed a lot of diapers over the years, and none of them stink as much as the contracting system that you're describing in this report. I want to start with the issue of minimum prices. When Canadians are trying to buy things, they try to find the best price that they can without compromising quality. Right now, so many Canadians are struggling and working overtime to hunt for those low prices. But paragraph 24 to 28 of your report describe a system for government purchasing that incredibly is intentionally designed to reward more costly bids and cut out lower bids. We have a procurement system that is designed to penalize the businesses that offer government lower prices. Not by accident, it's how the system is designed. You say, quote, this methodology disincentivizes bidders from proposing lower rates, end quote. To create a process that directly punishes suppliers for offering low prices suggests that the person designing the system is either completely insane or is intentionally looking for opportunities to funnel as much money to a preferred supplier as possible. Is there any possible justification for this system being designed this way?
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a fair question, and I think the answer lies in perhaps it was an attempt to address another known failing. So in examples where there's a low bidder who bids so low that they can't actually perform the work, but they need to ultimately have an opportunity to provide government services so that they can build up their resume and ultimately have experiences in subsequent opportunities, they bid below profit margins, right? So as a result, I think what's happened to the government in many, many instances is that supplier is not able to ultimately fulfill the services because it's no longer profitable for them. Or alternatively, they decline the work. So they've been awarded the contract based on the price, and when it comes time to delivering on the work, they don't do the work, so there's a significant amount of time lost. To address your question in terms of the price bands, though, I think what happened here is there was a deviation in the price band, and so as a result of the deviation, a clause that should have affected the ability to justify a low price wasn't available.
Can I just dig in on that? The system you're describing, though, is based on something in relation to median price. It's not based on any objective evaluation of, in some cases you could say this is obviously a price that's suspiciously low for whatever reason. You can imagine that happens. But if it's based on median price, then if I'm bidding, I have to worry about, and it's within the narrow band you described. I have to worry that if I offer the best price, and it happens to be just a little bit lower than what everybody else is offering, then I'm going to be penalized for being able to provide the best product at the lowest price. So I have to be increasing my price in order to ensure that I don't fall below. And I have no awareness of what prices the other suppliers are putting in. That creates a system, since it's based on median price, in which everybody is going to be bidding higher than they would otherwise because they're afraid of falling below. Right, so if you have 5 people bidding, and you want to make sure you're not too far below where everybody else is, then you're gonna bid higher. But basic economics tells us that everybody is then going to be driving up the price of the bid. So that's just going to exert significant continuous upward pressure on the price, given how this is designed. Like, it seems so obviously crazy, and it seems like it's an excuse. Not a reason. That there would be plenty of other ways of solving for the problem that you've suggested.
So I won't disagree with your characterization, because fundamentally that's also how we saw this issue. The only thing I will say, to be fair, is if the price support clause works effectively, it does allow a low bidder to ultimately then be accepted. Right? So what it requires them to do is provide invoices on previous contracts or to other clients demonstrating that they've been able to fulfill the work at that lower price point, and then that price would be accepted. Right. But I would agree with your characterization of it's still risky.
Right. Yeah, thank you. So who are the people who designed this crazy system? We've asked who made the decision to award the contract, but who is responsible for creating this system as it was?
Very briefly, please.
So I have no direct knowledge as to who would have designed this medium bands process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to go back to my original question regarding the lack of documentation and sort of bring that together with what my colleague raised in regards to the Globe and Mail article regarding Canada's Chief Technology Officer. With this finding, paired together with the allegations published last week that an IT specialist at CBSA is accusing a VP of erasing data, is it possible that data relating to the initial request for a bid may have been erased as well? And are you concerned at all that this is the case, that there is missing documentation and we have now these allegations of someone deliberately doing that?
So obviously the allegations are very concerning, particularly from a procurement standpoint. You will have noticed in our annual report, one of the things we identify is we don't have the right to compel documentation. And it's a particular frustration point for me, and I have to admit, when I watch these committee proceedings, I'm a bit envious of how you compel documentation. I would describe the authorities that we have as less than a Canadian citizen, because if I make an access to information request, at least it's protected under the Access to Information Act, and there are specific guidelines that need to be followed. With our request, there are no such guidelines, so we're acting on the goodwill of the parties to provide us the documentation. So where there is a lack of documentation, I'm never 100% clear whether it's the result of our inability to compel documentation, whether it's a purposeful exclusion or otherwise, right? And that's where I said, at what point do we start making negative inferences and stop just talking about documentation? And like I said, you'll hear documentation come up several times this evening, because it is one of the largest irritants that I have currently, not just in ArriveCAN, but in general, in order to perform the work that we need to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Going back to the 76% of the listed resources in successful bids that did no work on the ArriveCAN contracts, I'm thinking that this means that companies were winning bids based on the resources or subcontractors that they claimed would provide if they won the contract. And then when the time came to do the work, the companies that won switched their subcontractors. So my question in regards to that is, when these switches occurred, were there ever any reassessments of capabilities of the new resources or a renegotiation of the prices based on different resources? Is there any documentation to that? And I guess, was there ever a change in price when resources were substituted?
Thank you. I'll let Derek answer this one.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And there is a process set up, and that's through the task authorization process. So under these professional services contracts, as we stated earlier, no one was actually named in the contract. So anyone who was included in the bid wasn't named directly in the contract. They were only authorized to perform the work once they were added to a task authorization. So anyone who wasn't previously evaluated as part of the bid evaluation would have had to have been evaluated at the time that the task authorization was issued. So whenever we saw the documents, there were some missing. When those documents were on file, we were able to identify that, yes, the individuals that were put forward as replacements for those who were included in the bid, they met the minimum requirements for those positions. There was no renegotiation of rates, to answer your other question.
So with that answer, it is possible to conclude that potentially the vendors brought in resources that may not have cost them as much and therefore received a greater profit on the project.
That's a possibility. We don't have any information with that respect, though.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Mr. Brock, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for your report. Thank you for your transparency on this extremely important issue. I want to just circle back a little bit. There's a couple of comments that you prefaced earlier today that we have to focus in, this was during the pandemic, we had to move very quickly on this particular app. But you'd agree with me that notwithstanding the pandemic, the spending on this app does not give the Justin Trudeau government license to fleece the taxpayer. Would you agree with that comment? You laugh. Yes? Right? No prime minister should be doing that. Right? Is that a yes?
It's no comment.
No comment. Let's deal with the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the expansion of outsourcing. Last year alone, $14.6 billion was spent on federal outsourcing. This was 74% higher than when Justin Trudeau took government in 2015. He promised in 2015 to cut back down on the use of external consultants. But here we have GC Strategies, a two-person basement firm that since 2017 has received $46 million in taxpayer funds. And to your point, with zero IT experience, they are merely consultants. This despite the fact that Justin Trudeau, since the pandemic, has increased the federal public service by close to 40%. So, instead of hiring his own people in their own departments to find the IT professionals, we have GC Strategies and the shoddy work that GC Strategies has done. You'd agree with that concept?
I would agree.
Right. $25.3 million on the ArriveCAN app went to GC Strategies, correct?
The $25.3 million was the competitive contract. They were previously awarded 3 non-competitive contracts under which work was also performed for ArriveCAN.
Okay. And you said you followed previous committee work. You know all the times that Christian Firth has testified. You know that he is currently under RCMP investigation. Were you aware of that, sir?
So I wasn't aware of the status of the RCMP investigation. I was aware that there was allegations that there was RCMP investigations.
Right. Were you aware that he openly admitted to doctoring the resumes of some of the clients that he was working with to ensure that they would qualify for funding. Were you aware of that?
I did watch the testimony, yes.
Right, which is a fraud. It's a form of fraud. It's a forgery. So my question to you, sir, given the information you learned, the information that you had in 2022 and 21 with GC Strategies, in your opinion, was this indicative of a pattern of behavior by GC Strategies in terms of its shoddy, incomplete work, receiving millions of dollars of taxpayer funds since 2017? Did you cross-reference on other governmental contracts that GC Strategies successfully and miraculously won the bid to?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. We have to remain focused on the practices of the department that was ultimately subjected to the review. There was no focus on a specific supplier. Where there were specific suppliers mentioned in the report, it was for transparency purposes. So I don't want to give the perception that we were somehow reviewing GC Strategies. We were not.
I get that.
Yeah.
I get that. But did it pique your interest, though, sir, in terms of everything you've heard by way of the irregularity by which GC Strategies operates business?
Absolutely.
Okay. The other aspect I want to touch upon, I've got a half a minute. With all the problems and irregularities that you pointed out in your report, could all of this be fixed by regulation?
So I think the answer is more complex than likely the time allows. I will say a number of structural changes are required. The complexity of the procurement animal is so great that you do have entities that exist only for helping other firms comply with the set of regulations. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Even someone who has an incredible amount of experience in procurement still finds it incredibly difficult to navigate. And I think you can talk to any player in the system, whether it be a buyer, a supplier, a subcontractor. I mean, we heard from subcontractors at this committee express why they use individuals to bid on their behalf, because they don't want to participate in the process. So as long as that mentality exists, right, it's very difficult to go direct to those individuals. Derek, I'm not sure if you want to add.
That is our time, I'm afraid.
Chair, I just want to make two very clear clarifications, not only for this committee, Mr. Chair, but for Canadians who are watching currently. And the first item is that GC Strategies was not even formed until 2015. GC Strategies was not formed until 2015, and therefore it is impossible that the previous administration could have worked with GC Strategies. So this in fact is not true, that the previous government utilized GC Strategies that we are finding out a lot of very interesting information about through testimony in this committee, as well as through the good work of Mr. Merisseau and Mr. Yaglick. So that's the first clarification I want to make for this committee and for Canadians, Mr. Chair. And the second clarification I would like to make is that PHAC, the national organization that oversees the health of Canadians, actually publicly indicated that this application, this horrific application that cost $54 million to Canadians, did not save a single life. What it did was unfairly burden and imprison several Canadians as a result of terrible oversight and mismanagement from this government. And you know, it's unfortunate as well, Mr. Chair, because we see this consistently in committee and in the House of Commons as well. Accusations of the current government, even the Prime Minister, we saw this again today, trying to lay the blame of so many different problems that we face in this nation at this time, the current to the previous government, when the current government has been in place.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Years. So to be clear, Mr. Chair,
what is
I would like to clarify. Thank you so much.
We've drifted so far from the issue at hand.
What is your point of order, please?
I just want to know what the relevancy is here.
It's not a point of order, Mr. Kuzmierczak.
We're going on a tangent here.
Mr. Kuzmierczak, you know that's not a point of order. Mrs. Kusi, please continue.
The relevancy for Canadians that are watching is that we are in this committee. Government operations is seized consistently with getting the truth for Canadians. And again, we see members of the government trying to confuse Canadians with misfacts, misinformation. Here today specifically regarding the application saving lives and the use of the federal government under Prime Minister Harper using GC strategies, which was simply not the case. Now, Mr. Chair, with the remaining time that I have, I will continue on my questions. In your report, you state that 23 out of the 23 competitive contracts reviewed, you do not see instances where point-rated criteria unfairly restricted competition. We've now seen evidence that in other contracts, GC strategies had manipulated their resources information in order to meet the point criteria. And I think that's important because it's consistent with the bait and switch conversation that we've had throughout this meeting here today. So was this type of misconduct something that would have been covered within your review?
With respect to GC strategies, I guess with the we're one of the larger. Sorry, I'm pausing here because I was thinking more about the matrix, as Kristen Firth called it at the committee here. It's the evaluation grid that they use for resources added through task authorization. And I guess one of the most egregious things we saw with these was the practice of copying and pasting the criteria as experience for the individuals with no additional information to show how they actually demonstrated that they met those requirements. And this was through I think I quote 16 of the 42 task authorizations on the GC strategies contract. So that was rather troubling.
Thank you. I believe that's called plagiarism in most institutions. Continuing on that vein, it's mentioned that security clearances were switched on a contract because the CBSA wanted to work with a specific resource that did not fulfill the property security requirements. How often are departments able to simply lower security requirements to suit their own wants and needs over the security of Canadians? My other colleague had mentioned the national security exception, but here I'm referring specifically to the security clearances that were, and again, we're seeing the bait and switch, that were switched on a contract because the CBSA apparently wanted to work with a specific vendor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I should say that shouldn't happen, right? If the classification of security was accurate, then that shouldn't happen. And if there was an error and oversight, then I agree it should be corrected. So I'm not sure we can definitively say based on what we saw as to which category I would put it in, but I would agree with the characterization that it should not happen.
Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to both gentlemen for your time here this evening and your work on this important report. The last issue I wanted to raise is this situation that you've documented whereby proponents are essentially taking the mandatory criteria in the procurement documents, copying it, and then pasting it to reflect their own expertise and experience. And I'm curious as to, I'm familiar with this in some hiring processes too, where there are certain keywords that the employer is looking for in the job interview, and as long as you say those keywords, it doesn't even matter what order they're in. They tick a box, and then the empirical score goes up, and you have a greater chance of getting hired. How did the empirical rating process that you looked into treat this like really blatant gaming of the system here?
So the document itself specifically says that one cannot demonstrate experience by simply restating, and it gives the example. And yet that's exactly what was done and ultimately accepted.
So in those cases, obviously there's a score associated with those responses, even though the responses, as you've indicated, weren't allowed at all. How did they end up scoring when they did that copy and paste exercise?
Actually, it's interesting. I'll separate the two sides. The process when they put forward resources or individuals as part of the bid to win the contract, there seems to be much more rigor around the evaluation, the assessment of those resources at that phase. Where the issues that we really identified come up is at the task authorization phase after they've already been awarded the contract. And the way the system is designed, it's actually the vendor who completes the grid that's used to evaluate them, and they actually provide the scores, which are then signed off by the department. But
I've always found that I do the best on exams when I mark them myself. It's funny how that works, you know? Yeah, it's just astonishing. Maybe I'll leave my questioning on that note, Mr. Chair, and thank our witnesses again for their time this evening.
Well, thank you for turning over a few minutes time, Mr. Backrack, and for the humor. Mr. Genuis, please go ahead for 5.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you again to the witnesses. This really is some of the craziest stuff we've ever heard at this committee, and that's saying something because we've heard some pretty wild things at this committee. I do want to say you were asked questions by Mr. Kuzmarichuk about corruption. Obviously, you're not prosecutors or police officers, but I think it's pretty clear that activities like doctoring resumes in order to get contracts would constitute fraud, would constitute criminal activity, and would definitely constitute corruption. And it's interesting that Liberals want to weasel out of that, but I won't press you on that point because I understand it's not your area of expertise. I wanted to ask about the so-called experience criteria. The way the system is structured, as you describe it, is that people who bid for many of these contracts have to have done work for the Government of Canada before. So you might have a better product, you might have more experience working with other clients, other governments, other private sector clients, but if you don't have the direct experience working for the federal government, then you get cut out on that basis. So this means that you have a system where you have to be an insider to get the work. The same insider contractors get recycled over and over again by virtue of the fact that the rules specifically require you to be an insider. And this severely narrows the band of who can bid to specific existing insider companies. Again, how is this remotely defensible?
So I think you're referring to the section that speaks to mandatory criteria and how it would be next to impossible for any other bidder to meet those criteria. So again, it's a very disappointing outcome because when you run a competitive process, you're telling the universe that you want the best outcome and you want competition. But yet you structure the mandatory criteria in a way that essentially eliminates the competitive aspect. So to answer your question, does it make sense? It does not make sense.
Right. Yeah. So hypothetically, you have a company based in the Maritimes that has done extensive IT work for the 4 provinces on the East Coast, as well as, let's say, for some states in the northeast of the U.S. They see a contract for the federal government that seems like a good fit, and based on this criteria, they can't bid at all, even though they've done IT work for other governments, just because they don't have that federal government experience. This seems like a system designed to protect insiders and exclude outsiders, so that those insiders can charge higher prices and continue to get the same jobs over and over again, regardless of quality.
So it is something that, it's not a requirement in all solicitations that one have previous government experience. That being said, it often is one of the characteristics that's used in mandatory criteria to diminish the field of eligible options. Right. So when we see that, it often draws our attention in noting that it's a restrictive criteria, and then there has to be a justification. And that's the other side, right? When you develop these mandatory criteria, you need to be able to justify why they are so essential to delivering on the ultimate outcome. And in many instances, there might be justifiable reasons. But when you couple everything together, it's impossible to meet all of those characteristics and still have an open, fair, and competition.
Right, thank you. I think the last thing you said, let's underline. If you take all those pieces together, it's impossible to have a fair and open competition. You've put together this excellent report. I'm not as familiar with the processes of your office, so I just want to understand this. Is there some process by which the government will be required to provide a written response to your recommendations?
So the response to the recommendations is actually embedded in the report. So you'll see that, and that's actually part of the process. But I will say that we also do follow up. So 2 years from the date of finalization of the report, we will commence the process of actually assessing compliance with the recommendations.
Okay, so you'll have a follow-up process to assess compliance. Did the government accept all of your recommendations?
Yes, they did.
Okay, so they're saying they've accepted them. We'll have a chance to see whether they actually follow through on them later on. Now, if I can just again circle back quickly to the issue of the missing records. You have no way of knowing why those records are missing. It could be because somebody deleted those records. It could be because they were never submitted. It could be because conversations happened in an informal setting or over the phone that should have happened in another way. Your report highlights the fact that as part of the ArriveCAN procurement, there seems a bizarre pattern of missing records. You don't know why that is, but you're underlining the fact that this is strange and unusual. Is that fair?
It is fair, but what I will also say is what we have heard is that it's a very pandemic-specific issue. So you went from an environment where almost all records were paper to an environment where it was impossible. Everyone was working remotely, and as a result, there were no record-keeping practices. That being said, I think people understand that they still have an obligation to keep accurate records, whether they're working remotely or in an office taking them on physical paper. So while I have heard that explanation and I'm understanding of that explanation, it doesn't dilute the fact that you still have to have appropriate record-keeping safeguards to ensure exactly what we've seen does not occur.
There would have been emails. There would have been some kind of back and forth, surely.
Thank you, gentlemen.